Next up are the phytoplasmas, and I have to say I think this is probably my favorite group of plant pathogens. When you get to the phytoplasmas, you're entering the twilight zone because the symptoms that these organisms induce are incredibly bizarre, and we'll take a look at some photos in just a second. I often refer to phytoplasmas as quote-unquote funky bacteria. They are bacteria-like organisms, although they are technically not true bacteria. They're technically in a group of organisms called the mollicutes. They're about the same size, though, as true bacteria, maybe a little bit smaller, and they are different from true bacteria in that they do not have that nice rigid wall. I mentioned that bacteria have a rod shape or a spherical shape. The phytoplasmas don't have that, and so they tend to have all kinds of different shapes, and their shape can change depending upon the particular environment that they're in. So they may start out spherical, they may eventually become rod-shaped, they may be some shape in between. These organisms are what is called phloem limited. That means that they only live in the phloem, which is the food conducting tissue inside the plant. You can see these organisms with a light microscope, but you need to use special stains in order to do it. Quite frankly, if you really want to see what a phytoplasma cell looks like, you need to use an electron microscope just the way that you would for a viral pathogen. They reproduce in a manner that's very similar to that of true bacteria, binary fission again, and so they have a phytoplasma chromosome. It replicates to make two copies. Those migrate to opposite ends of the cell. The cell pinches off in the center, and you end up with two cells that are genetically identical. These organisms, like many viruses, are transmitted by insects, in particular leafhoppers. So we typically see an increase in these sorts of diseases in the environment when we have an influx of leafhoppers come into an area. As I mentioned, you can see phytoplasma cells inside plant tissue using a light microscope, but you need to use certain types of stains or dyes in order to do this. And these particular dyes glom on to the DNA inside the phytoplasma cell, and then when you shine ultraviolet light on these dyes, they glow. And in this particular case, I have a black arrow pointing toward this glowing mass inside a phloem cell. That's what that long, narrow cell is in the center of the slide. You can actually see a lot of these little glowing areas, and those are phytoplasma cells that have been lit up by this dye under UV light. Now you may say, well, plant cells have DNA. How do we know we're not looking at the plant DNA? Well, the phloem inside a plant should be devoid of DNA. That particular tissue is basically just a tubing. It should not have plant DNA inside, so if we start seeing DNA, that's a good indication that we're dealing most likely with a phytoplasma issue. This is my favorite slide of my entire slide collection. On the left is a purple coneflower that's healthy. On the right is a purple coneflower that's been infected with a phytoplasma, specifically the aster yellows phytoplasma. You can see several different very bizarre symptoms on this plant. The strappy structures at the bottom of the flower are equivalent to the purple ray flowers, or quote-unquote petals, on the purple coneflower. This sort of greening of flower parts that normally would have a color is typical of a phytoplasma infection. Also, if you take a look at the cone portion of the infected flower, you'll notice that it's quite leafy, and leafy flower parts is another typical symptom of a phytoplasma infection. And then you see a bouquet of secondary flowers coming up out of that cone, and that cluster, what's called a broom, is another typical symptom of a phytoplasma infection. So flower parts that are green rather than their normal color, leafy looking flowers, and brooming, those are all symptoms of a phytoplasma infection. Another example of brooming, in this case a tree, an ash tree that's infected with the ash yellows phytoplasma. You can see where there's not a lot of leaf tissue on this tree. The leaves are few and far between, but you've got all of these little clusters of small branches that are being formed in tufts. And again, this is a symptom called brooming. I tend to refer to this as the poodle tree because it kind of looks like the tree has had a poodle cut. Phytoplasmas can also induce a flattening and widening of branches. This symptom is called fasciation. An example of this symptom is shown in this slide on a woody ornamental. Also notice how there are a lot of lateral buds, and that is induced by the presence of the phytoplasma as well. Interestingly, you can go to floral shops and find branches like this that they sell for flower arrangements. Some of these may be due to genetic abnormalities in the plant, but I suspect in some situations that flattening and widening of the branches is actually due to a phytoplasma infection. Can you guess what type of plant this is? Look very carefully in the upper left. There are the remains of some flowers there, and if you look very closely, you may get a sense that this plant is a cosmos plant, but unfortunately a cosmos plant that is infected with the aster yellow's phytoplasma. Typical symptoms that we're seeing here, you'll notice a little bit of yellowing. The diseases caused by phytoplasmas are oftentimes referred to as yellow diseases because a primary symptom is yellowing of foliage. You'll also notice a lot of distorted growth, so twisting and cupping and curling of leaves and stems. Again, this is a typical symptom that we see associated with phytoplasmas. And then the last of the symptoms are those leafy green flowers that I mentioned previously. If I were only to see the foliage on this plant with the growth distortions and yellowing, I might not immediately think that a phytoplasma is the problem. I might look into possible herbicide issues because, again, there are certain types of herbicides, the so-called growth regulator herbicides, that will cause a lot of particularly growth distortions, but sometimes also yellowing in foliage. But the dead giveaway here that we're dealing with a phytoplasma disease is the presence of those really funky looking flowers that are leafy and green.